Okay. Well, so we are here in the book of Ecclesiastes, and I want to give you a little bit of the background to my history with the book of Ecclesiastes, because it does play a really important role in understanding the book, at least how I'm going to teach it. I got to teach Ecclesiastes. I started my love of Ecclesiastes back when I was in college. I had the grand idea of let's memorize the whole book. Still haven't accomplished that because, you always got to keep an objective out in front of you, so you just keep putting that one off. I do hope to do it someday. But the book of Ecclesiastes is one of those just rich books. For some reason, it's always been special to me personally. And when I got back to my church in New Hampshire that I used to help at, the Sunday school teacher asked me to cover for him for about 5 weeks. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to do a study through the book of Ecclesiastes. And I wanted to treat the book of Ecclesiastes like it was a science project. You got to love science. I used to teach it. And science is one of those things that you have the idea, you have a hypothesis, and you say, you know what, I think this is how this works, and then you go do the experiment, you see whether your experiment worked, you come up with a conclusion, you go back to the drawing board, and you just keep repeating that. And so I wanted to treat Ecclesiastes like it was Solomon's science experiment. He's asking the question, what is a life worth living? He's asking the question, what brings meaning to life? And he says, all right, let's try this. Does his experiment, completely fails, comes back to the drawing board, says, all right, let's try that one, completely fails, comes back to the drawing board over and over and over again. And then as an old man, he collects all of his findings, and he is preaching to an audience of younger people and saying, all right, I want to warn you, this is what life is worth, and this is what life is not worth. So that was 5 weeks, and the Sunday school teacher heard it and said, I want you to keep going. And so a solid year later, literally, I finally, I think, finished the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes was a rich study. It was funny. It was one of those things that as I studied it, there were certain topics that come up a lot. And one of the topics that came up, and we'll, Lord willing, be able to build on this point later, but one of the topics that came up was money. I mean, Solomon, if there was ever a guy that was filthy rich, it was Solomon. They said that as you read through 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you get some of the background to Solomon's life, one of the points they make in there is a stone of the street. Silver was like a stone of the street. Can you imagine being so rich that a chunk of silver, I don't even know what silver's going for an ounce now, but between the last few years, it's been between $20 and $40 an ounce. I don't think anyone's going to go, silver's not worth picking up. You find a lump of it lying on the ground, I bet most of us would go, thank you. But Solomon is just so filthy rich that he goes, it's not even worth my time. And so Solomon approaches this thing, and so money comes up a whole lot. And one of the convictions for me was I had been teaching in a Christian school. I wasn't wealthy by any stretch, but I had enough. And I just remember driving an hour to school each day, driving the bus, and I would just muse. You're trying to find something to entertain your brain, and so I would think like, okay, what would I do if I had like $1 trillion? Or what would I do? And I was just kind of musing. And even though I had been teaching through Ecclesiastes, and very specifically Solomon says things like money doesn't satisfy, I found myself musing going, I wish I had just a little more. Like, I think I'd be happy. And I'm like, and then as you teach through the book of Ecclesiastes verse by verse, you come upon almost the same exact outline again and again and again. And I felt like I was just using the same outline, literally. And it would be like, I'm just going verse by verse. And so guess what, guys? It's this topic again. And about the third time I taught through it, I finally had to stop and go, you're teaching this, and yet you're not listening to your own messages that you're teaching through the book of Ecclesiastes. Like, you still think in the back of your mind, just a little bit more and I'd be happy. And Solomon's saying, I had more than you could ever imagine, and I realized it didn't satisfy. And so it was one of those convicting moments for me that I just, every time I teach through Ecclesiastes, I have to bring up, because it was something that, of all people, I should have been internalizing. I was teaching it. I was studying it. I was making this my life for those times. And yet it still wasn't sinking in. And so, like, figuratively speaking, I had to slap myself. Might have been literally. I don't remember. But I had to say, listen. Listen to what Solomon is saying. And so fast forward a few years. You guys know I work at camp. And what I do at camp is I work with the teen campers. And so what we do at teen camp, and I have to joke about it because on paper it sounds really boring. I will be completely candid with you. All right? On paper, we take a historical theme like Lewis and Clark or gold mining or something like that. And we say, we're going to make a whole theme out of it, like the Pony Express. Yeah. And I'm like, okay. Teens obviously know there's more going on than that. And what we do is we take that historical theme and we try to marry it to a scriptural theme that we can dovetail the two together. We still want it to be fun. We don't want it to be like, get up in the morning and we're going to play the allegory game. But we want it to be something that they can go home at the end of the week and go, I had a lot of fun, but okay, that lesson's going to stick. All right? And so specifically speaking about Ecclesiastes, one summer we were doing the Lewis and Clark theme, and we started trying to think of what is something that goes along with Lewis and Clark that could be a spiritual concept. And being that I love Ecclesiastes, my mind went to there, and it was this idea of follow your guide. So Lewis and Clark would not have made it across the country if they had not had a network of guides who knew the area. They knew which paths to take. They knew how to build things. They knew how to communicate with the natives. They were friends with them, and they could come and say, all right, you don't want to say this, you don't want to do that. And imagine if Lewis and Clark had not listened to their guides. Imagine if they had gone into life saying, I know better. What would the end result of their journey have been? It would have been utter failure. They would have come back limping if they came back at all. They would have lived a life of failure and gone, I blew it. I completely and utterly blew it, and they would have been able to say, because I didn't listen to the guides who knew better. And so that year, what we did is we set up, as part of the stage and part of the scoring, a museum. And what we were doing is we were setting up a museum. I know, like unbelievably exciting. But we were setting up a museum recounting the failed journey of Lewis and Clark. And what we did is we came up with fake journals. And these fake journals were written by Lewis and Clark, and they told of the mistakes they made and the successes they made. So like one of them always failed at everything and the other one kind of succeeded. And what we were doing is we gave these books to them at the beginning of the week, and they carried them around, and these books had secrets on how to play the games, certain things that were coming up. One of the little hints in here is they kept talking about this guy called the Chief who showed up at their camp and asked them if they had memorized a verse together and built a bow together. And if they did, he rewarded them greatly for it. And just hinted at those things. And then throughout the announcements, we'd be like, hey, the Chief is coming. Who's the Chief? And what we saw, and this is so indicative of again, the different reactions Christians have to the Bible, we saw some of those campers take this book and just absolutely digest it. Like they were poring over it, finding things, trying to figure out, like there were secret items that were hidden around camp that the book would tell you where to find them. There were secret rules to the game. So one of the rules we did, we were playing dodgeball, and I slipped a blue bucket onto the basketball court. And in the journal, they talked about, we played this game with the natives, and we broke one of their blue vases, and they got really upset at us. And so we were playing a game, and they're like, why is there a blue bucket on the basketball court? I don't know. Every time they hit it, it would reset their score. And so we were trying to build some of those little hints and tricks, but we saw some of the kids would just absolutely digest it to the point where they were almost a step ahead of me. Like I had put too many hints in here. And so there was one where they had to find, a thing going on at the arena. Some of them read it and went straight to the arena. They didn't follow any of the clues, delete, and I'm like, you're here too soon. Go, but they were that good. But then there was others. They didn't read this to the point where they almost lost it. And like a week later, I find this by the mud pit, and I'm like, oh, I can see you guys really, really cared about what was written in this book. And what we were trying to get them to do, because we were studying through Ecclesiastes at the same time that week, is we were trying to drill home the idea that there are people who've gone before you who have preserved things that you are to follow. There are things written that if you take the time to learn it, it will keep you from making the same mistakes. It will keep you on the right path. It will help you live the good life. Not according to the world's definition, but according to the Bible's definition. And so how we tied it in is Ecclesiastes is Solomon's journal. Ecclesiastes is the writing of the wisest king who ever lived, who came along and said, guys, I've been there, done that, gotten multiple t-shirts. I know what I'm talking about. Will you listen to what I write in this book? And that's why I want to push us this morning. I want to look at the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, Lord willing, we'll be able to continue this series next week, weather permitting. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to introduce you to some of the main concepts of the book of Ecclesiastes. We may get into a little bit of why Solomon is a trustworthy guide, because we all understand, as you study out Solomon's life, the man made some very serious mistakes. He sinned in some very, very serious ways, and he's writing this book at the end of his life as kind of a cynical old man, if you want to put it like that. Like, he's looking back on his life and going, vanity of vanities, which you can translate as meaningless or pointless or empty. I'll explain more in detail on that word. But he's more or less coming at the end of his life and just going, all these things I sought for, they're just empty. And that's a sad end. Like, that's a really, really sad end, to come to the end of your life and look back at everything you've done and just go, what's the point? Why? Why did I waste all of that? And then he writes the book, and I find it telling, because at the very end of the book, he turns around and he points to young people and says, all right, I've talked about my whole life. Young people, here's some things I want you to learn. And then we'll tie it in, because I think there's something to be said, specifically a specific verse in chapter 11 that says, because the preacher was wise, he set in order many proverbs. And I think there's something to be said about, as you get older, saying, I am going to choose younger people to invest in, and I'm going to make sure they can remember these things that I've taught them. I was talking to a pastor this summer who came and spoke, and he said he has like all these little adages, all these little like sayings that he teaches his kids. And he's like, oh, and number 51 is, and he's rattling off all these like wise sayings that he's taught them. And I think there's something to be said about that. I think there's something to be said about saying, we are going to make sure the next generation knows this. And so Solomon, that's the whole point of why he wrote his whole book, to say, hey, next generation, know this and don't repeat it. And so that's why I think it's very, very valuable to dig in here. So let's dig in. All right, let's look at Ecclesiastes. We're going to start on, the first question I would open up is, why do we even need a guide? I think I've already kind of proven the point, but why would we need a guide? Well, think about it. We need a guide because there are areas we don't understand. There are things that we experience in life we have no context for. I know first time I ever went to San Francisco, I had no idea how to get around that city. That's not exactly, I'm from the East Coast. On the East Coast, we don't go in alleyways, okay? When you're in a big city, you don't wander through a back alley. Now, a big city to me was Boston, so, But I don't wander into alleyways, but, my friends took me to Chinatown. They're like, we're going to go up this alley. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? They're like, yeah, there's something really cool up here. It's like, no, you don't say that in New England, because something really cool, that's not where you want to go. But it helped to have a guide, because it was my first time. I didn't know what was going on. If you've ever moved into a new job area, I remember I was working at camp, and the director came and he's like, hey, you're going to be the school administrator. Sure, what's that like? I don't know what that involves. And he's like, yeah, you're gonna just take care of all this. And so I'm emailing other administrators. What do I do? What are things I should? And you find out all sorts of things that administrators do that you're like, I had no idea that was a thing. Like every October, you got to file this paperwork with the government. Can't file it early, and if you file it late, you're in trouble. So you got between like October 1st and 15th to get that paperwork in. Oh, cool. What district am I in? I don't know. Let's search the... And so I needed a guide to basically remind me of some of these things, to say, hey, know this. And so I think to say we need a guide is obvious, because there are areas that we don't understand. There's areas that are new. But also there's just sometimes a help to say, I need someone to come alongside. And Solomon will put it this way. He says, you got two. If one walks alone and he falls, there's not another to help him up. And a threefold cord is not soon broken. If one lies alone, he won't have heat. Two lies together, they'll have heat. And he's using these illustrations of just the comfort and agreement two people can have walking side by side. And that's the beauty, like even me and my wife, where we're of such kindred spirits on a lot of things that like we tag team all the time. There's a lot of stuff I couldn't do if it weren't for her. And so you need those companions, you need those people to come alongside you. And so the question I ask then is, why then, since we need a guide and we understand that, why is Solomon a guide worth listening to? And I think that's answered in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. But if I can summarize, Solomon is a guide worth listening to because he has the experience hands down. He knows what he's talking about. But the question might arise where you say, well, what about all the sin that Solomon did? I mean, the man went into idolatry. The man got involved in some situations that you would look at and go, you weren't trusting God there, Solomon. And you could go through Solomon's life and find more than enough handles to grab onto and say, that was wrong, that was wrong, that was... Why is Solomon a guide worth following? And I think just because Solomon went through that actually makes him a better guide. Allow me to explain. If you have someone, and I was reading in 1 Peter last week, in 1 Peter, it talks about the riotous living that some of these Christians had been in before they got saved. And as Peter looks at these Christians, he says this, he says, suffice it to have your past in that stuff. And so as he's looking at these Christians and saying, look at the stuff that you came out of, let it suffice you that all of that stays in the past. Don't go back into it. And think about that. Because if you are a person who came out of wicked sin, who of all people is more qualified to look at a younger person and say, do not go into that, than you? Because you have the scars. You have the damage to say, you think, because you're young and stupid, you think that this is going to turn out well. Let me tell you otherwise. And let me show you in the Bible where the Bible also tells you otherwise. But in case you don't listen to the Bible, can I show you my scars? And I think there's power to that because there's the testimony to say, you may look at me right now and I may look like a Christian who's got it all together, but let me tell you about what I came from. And my mom would talk about that. You know, she got saved as a teenager, but, you know, the stuff that happened to her before she got saved, and she would talk about, that's why we don't do that. And that's why we don't do that. And that's why we don't do that. Because there are things that you say, I came out of that. I know the pain. I know the harm. I know the damage. Suffice it to leave those things in your unsaved state. Do not go forward in that. And think about some of the stuff Solomon did. He is a man who said, I sought after wealth. I sought after architecture and wisdom and all of these things to try to figure out, is there anything beyond God that could possibly bring satisfaction? And you know what he did? No. In fact, all of it was nothing but emptiness and pain. So don't go there. And that's why I think with all of the sin that Solomon committed, he is actually the better witness to say, I've actually been there. It's not theoretical. I know it for a fact. I've done the experiment. I bore the damage so that you don't have to. And so that's where I think as an older generation, you can look at younger guys like me and others and say, no, don't do that. Why? Let me tell you. And that's the beauty of where Solomon can be our guide. And so I think, first of all, Solomon is a good guide because of what he's gone through. But let's look at some other things that make Solomon a good guide. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. Solomon is a guy who took care to put things together for us. In fact, the book of Ecclesiastes is set up almost like a lecture. You could almost make a comparison to a debate. And so what Solomon is doing is he's kind of bringing up like, here's the point, here's the counterpoint, here's the point, here's the counterpoint. And he's almost arguing back and forth with himself. But it's set up like a lecture. And specifically in this first verse, it says the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. He's lecturing. He's lecturing to a group almost and saying, all right, I am the speaker. That's specifically what that word preacher comes from. It's a Hebrew word, kohelet, and it basically means the one who's speaking to a congregation. And so what he's doing is he's getting up and he's saying, the words of the Kohelet, the words of the preacher, I'm talking to you, my assembled crowd. Let me tell you what I've learned. And so if you've ever been to one of those lectures where somebody goes and they've done all this work to collect all this information, and then they're coming and they're sitting before a podium, like this, and they're saying, let me tell you the things I learned. And now you're getting to bear all of the stuff, all the profit from what they've learned, all the work they did, you're getting to be part of, and you don't have to go do all the research yourself. And that's what he's doing with this book. And he says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And here we come upon our first key word with the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes has a few key words I want you to understand. We're going to be building off of these this morning, and then, Lord willing, next week, like I said, weather permitting. But one of the key words in the book of Ecclesiastes, if you've ever read it, you've seen this word a million times. The word is vanity. The word vanity literally is a Hebrew word, Hevel, which means vapor. Okay, that's the literal meaning of the word. Now, if you have a King James version, and I've studied it, and as commentaries kind of compare the different versions, they're like, well, it's translated this way and this one and this. King James will pretty much always translate vanity as Hevel as vanity. So if you see this word vanity in Ecclesiastes, you know it's the same Hebrew word showing up over and over. Like I said, depending on what version you're looking at, sometimes other versions are actually trying to interpret it for you, because the word Hevel has a lot of different meanings based on the context. Okay, so sometimes it has the idea of meaningless or empty or frustrating or, but what's beautiful about the King James English here is it literally is just saying, when you see the word Hevel, you translate it vanity, and then you leave the context to determine what it means, because the word can have different meanings based on the context. This word Hevel, again, vapor is the literal translation of it. Think about vapor. Think about how fleeting vapor is. Think about how insubstantial vapor is. Think about, let's say you have vapor that looks like a certain shape, and when you reach out to grab it, it just dissolves underneath your hand. Okay? I like, it's a slightly different comparison, but I like to use the comparison from mythology, if you'll bear with me. But you might be familiar with the will-o'-the-wisp. All right? And so the will-o'-the-wisp is this mythical little thing that floats out in the swamp, and it draws your attention off, and you wander off the path into the swamp. And right when you think you have reached the will-o'-the-wisp and you reach out to grab it because it's the shiny little object, it goes poof, and it vanishes and it appears farther back and keeps drawing you deeper into the swamp, and I don't know, until you drown or something. And that's the idea of the will-o'-the-wisp. That's the idea of vapor. So you're looking at something, and let's say, again, to use Solomon's illustration, he's looking at life and he's saying, what is a life worth living? What is the profit? What is the good? What should we be living for? And he says, let's take money. And so what he has is out in front of him, he has this figment of his imagination called money that will supposedly satisfy him. So he sets his course, starts heading toward that direction. And as he gets closer and closer, just like a mirage, it starts to vanish. It's Hevel. It's a frustration that, like, I thought I reached it. I came to the point where back there, like, you're standing here looking at the back of the church going, that's where my destination is. And as you get closer and closer, it's now vanished and moved farther back. And once you get to that point, now it's moved even farther back. And once you get to that point, it's moved farther back. Or the other illustration to keep in your mind would be, let's say you've got something insubstantial. It's Halloween, people like ghosts and all that. Imagine you've got the insubstantial vague shape of something, and the moment you go up to try to grab onto it, it just goes whoof, and it's gone, and you're like, well, what do I do now? This is my mission. This is what I came for, and I reached it, and I reached out to grab it, and whoof, it's gone. That's this idea of Hevel. So he's going over and over with all of these illustrations and saying, all of these things that I thought would have a solid outcome, would have a substantial benefit to them, when I reached them, it was like vapor. It just poof. And you notice he's like vanity of vanity. So like Hevel upon Hevel. And that's why sometimes this word could be translated meaningless or frustrating or pointless or empty. Or, it's not vanity in the sense of pride. Like our modern sense of the word vanity. Like, oh, I've got a vanity mirror. Okay, that's not an empty mirror. That's not what our English word means today. So that's why you have to kind of wrap your mind around the original Hebrew reading, which is Hevel, vapor. That, just think of vapor whenever you see the word vanity. And what he's doing is he's going through all of these things that are substantial in his mind and saying, yeah, they're about as substantial as vapor, which we understand really well today because the clouds are all over the place. That's about as substantial as things are, okay, in this, okay? So you notice he says, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And so you think he's trying to make a point. He said the word vanity 5 times in that one verse. All right? And so just, again, if we translated it meaningless, can you just imagine someone standing on a street corner and just going, meaningless, meaningless. It's all meaningless. It's so meaningless. It's just meaningless. You're like, what happened? What happened to you? You know, and you'd be sincerely worried about this guy if at the end of his life he's just saying the word meaningless, meaningless, empty, empty, empty. Now, you look at the next one. He says, what profit hath a man of all his labor that he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. And so what he's noticing here, and this is what he's guiding us with, is he's saying, I'm not actually saying, this is Solomon speaking, that the earth is immortal and the earth will never go away. But for all intents and purposes, the earth is eternal. For all intents and purposes, how fleeting human life is, the earth has been around a lot longer, and if one of us is going to give, it's going to be the human. You know? And so he's using the illustration of, with all of the cycles and all the movements and all the things that happen on the earth, it's like it's eternal, and all the difference we as humans hope we can make, the earth can take it out in one little move. I mean, you think about it. You know, you got the great San Francisco earthquake of the early 1900s. That just, you got all these buildings and the earth just goes, and then the whole city just falls over. And it's like, the earth didn't care. You know, the earth wasn't like, oh, I'm sorry, I broke your building. No, the earth says, yeah, I wanted to move. And so one of us was going to move, so I moved. And your city's gone. I mean, you think like the city of Pompeii. You know, this massive city, and a volcano goes poof, and the city's gone. And the earth is just like, yeah, I just broke your stuff. Yeah, I mean, and that's the way the earth acts. And what Solomon is saying is, because he'll go to architecture, he'll go to great works of literature, he'll go to all this, and he'll just say, you can work really hard to do all this stuff, but guess what? The earth is still going to be around, and it's just going to mess with your stuff, and nobody's going to remember you. I come from the town where my church was in New Hampshire was this town called Tilton. And the guy who started the town was apparently very full of himself, because you have statues all over the town of Tilton that meant something to Mr. Tilton. And on the hillside overlooking Tilton is this big archway called the Tilton Arch. And like, so he names the town after himself and has this big arch set up and all these statues. Nobody knows who Tilton is. Nobody cares. It's just a town. It's just a name. But here's this guy, Tilton, who did all of this work and set up this town and did all that. And it's like, Tilton, we don't, like, if I passed you in the street, I wouldn't know who you are. But I bet he thought really highly of himself, and he thought he was a quite impressive character because he put all these monuments up in his own name. Nobody cares. And that's what Solomon is doing, is he's setting up all of these monuments, all of these things, and saying, yeah, the earth is still going to abide, but all of this stuff is going to go away. Every inch of it. And he says, what profit then has a man of all his labor which he takes? Because every generation goes away. You know, you think about all the great and powerful and rich men, and most of them we don't even remember who they are. We definitely don't remember what they look like. We might know their name, but if we saw them, we would not know even enough to give them any esteem because we don't know who they are. And you've got these massive buildings, and he says, the sun, I mean, of all things, the sun, which seems to have the greatest difference making on the earth, it just keeps going through the same cycle every day too. You know, it rises in the morning, goes around, goes at night, comes back, goes around, goes again. It's cycles. It just keeps happening. And it says, the wind goeth toward the south and turneth about toward the north. It whirleth about continually. The wind returneth again according to its circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. So all these rivers who have their great grand aspiration of let's flood the ocean. And he's like, nope, even they can't do it. They just keep going back about the same cycles, and it just keeps doing its thing. And so what he's saying is, all of these things in nature that think they're making a huge difference, yet they don't. It's just a cycle. That cycle goes and comes back and goes and comes back. And it's just, and that's why he's like, it's just vanity. All this labor, all this work, even nature itself, it's just frustrating. It's just, I can't even make sense of it. And he keeps going. He says, all things are full of labor. Man cannot even utter it. There's so much work going on everywhere that you can't even put it into words. And he says, the eye is not satisfied with seeing, the ear is not filled with hearing. The thing that has been, it is that which shall be, that which is done is that which shall be done. There is no new thing under the sun. That doesn't mean no one ever invents anything new. He's just saying, everything just keeps cycling back around. You know, you invented a car. What's a car for? Traveling from one place to another. Oh, that's cool. So, like modern horse and buggy. Yeah, like a modern shoe. Yep. Yeah, so basically anything, you haven't invented anything new because all the cities just move farther apart so you don't save any time. Good. You know, and he's just saying like it's just these same frustrating cycles. And he says, is there anything new whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It's already been. It has already been of old times, which is before us. There's just no remembrance of the former things. Neither shall there be any remembrance of the things that come with those that come after. And so you're kind of, now, what I want to pause and say about the book of Ecclesiastes is be very, very careful that you do not take Ecclesiastes out of context. All right? When he's saying things like, there is no new thing under the sun. Like I said, obviously there was a day when this church didn't exist. And then someone came and said, we're going to build a church here. He's not saying, well, that's not a new church because there's no new thing under the sun. You know? And so that means this church always existed. No, that's not what he's getting at. He's saying there are these cycles, there are these concepts. You know, people come up with a new idea. They probably didn't come up with a new idea. There was always a means to transport people from point A to point B. It's just the method has changed a little bit. You know, there was always a way of writing things down or marking things down. It's just the method has changed. You know, what's a computer? But a library. This just doesn't require a big giant building to do it in. You know, and his point isn't that there is no new thing. It's there really are no new ideas. There's a cycle. And we think we came up with something new because we forgot about the last guy who came up with that same idea. And so be very careful because there are times where Solomon will look at young people and say, yeah, just go live however you want. Okay, he's not literally saying live however you want. He's saying let's play some mind games here. And in this game we're playing, go ahead, go try to live however you want, see what happens. You know, he's playing devil's advocate sometimes where he is bringing up ideas and you've got to be very careful to look at what his flow of thought is before you just rip a certain passage out and go, see, Solomon says we all just die and go into the dirt. I mean, yes, we do all just die and go in the dirt, but when he says that, you know, how do you know that the spirit of man goes to heaven? He's playing a mental game with his audience, so you've got to pay attention. You can't just rip that verse out. And so that's why I want to teach you the key words, because the first key word is vanity. It's this idea of vapor, of kind of the pointlessness of it all and the frustration. But as we continue, we're going to come upon another key phrase called vexation of spirit. And so he'll say this, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. And you go, well, what's that other word mean? What's that vexation of spirit all about? The vexation of spirit, in a more literal sense, is like trying to catch the wind with a net. It's a frustrating task that you will never quite accomplish. I like to use the illustration of herding cats. All right? And so if you would imagine, and bear with me with this illustration, imagine I opened this door right over here, to the side office, and I said, all right, I'm going to let 300 cats into this room, and I want you to herd them out that door back there. So I open up the door, cats just come swarming in, and we all know that they're rather stubborn, they do whatever they want to do, and so if you're trying to get them out that door, it's going to involve some pain, it's going to involve a lot of frustration, a lot of backtracking, a lot of doing the same thing over and over and over again, and ultimately you're just going to be a lot of hurt. All right? I mean, we've all experienced that where you're like, oh, it's such a cute cat, and then it's like, and it just, claws in the arm, and you're like, okay, I'm done. Imagine that illustration when we think of the concept of vexation of spirit. Because, and it goes along with the Hevel idea, you have lived your life to accomplish a certain goal, you get it, and you realize it has none of the pleasing abilities that you thought it would. What does that do to you on the inside? When you've sought and you've striven and you've done all this work and you get to the end and you're like, yes, I'm done. And then you're like, wait, that was it? It's like if you've ever been to an amusement park, you wait an hour in line to go on the roller coaster, and you got like 10 seconds of like, woo! And then you're done, and you're like, are you kidding me? I remember when I was a kid, we went to Universal Studios with my parents, and this was the one down in Florida, and they had just opened this ride for Twister or something, and we thought it was a ride. We thought, like, oh, it's like a tornado-themed ride. This is going to be awesome. And I remember waiting for over an hour, in the Florida sun. You're being in that queue, going back and forth, and you're like, okay, this had better be worth it. I mean, it's new. They put probably millions of dollars in this. This should be awesome. And you get there, and it's kind of a walkthrough, like, simulator of how they do things in the movie. And I mean, it's neat and all, but I don't know that I'd walk through it if there was no line today. I'm not interested. And so, like, you walk up to the little guardrail and you're sitting there like, and this is how we make a tornado. Oh, look, that cow. And you're like, what? I just waited an hour for that? And you really did. Like, you spend all that money to go to the theme park, and you spend an eighth of your time in the theme park waiting for something that literally is what was that? But think of how much stuff people live for, that when they get to the end and they get the stuff they sought for, they go, I mean, that was it? I mean, that was it? Like, what? And that's why Solomon, he's going to say, you've got the vanity idea, where there's this emptiness, this vapor, and then there's the vexation of spirit that comes along with that, because you're like, that didn't push any of the buttons. I thought that would satisfy, but it didn't. Now I want you to take those two terms, set them over here, because the condition of those two terms is the third phrase. And the third phrase you're going to find is this idea of under the sun. So for a moment of illustration, I'm sorry, I just apologized to a lamp. But I want you to think, for the sake of argument, that the ceiling is where everything ended. So if I said there is nothing above the ceiling, let me ask you a simple question. Is there a point to praying if there's no one above the ceiling? There's no one up there. What's the point? Is there a point to serving God? Is there a point to saving money? Is there a point to leaving an inheritance to your children? If there is nothing above the sun, there's nothing after this. And so when you see some of those difficult passages in Ecclesiastes, I want you to do a little trick, and I want you to look around, because what Solomon might be doing is saying, let us pretend, for the sake of argument, there is no God. Let us pretend, for the sake of argument, that God isn't listening, that God doesn't care, that God isn't going to reward or punish or anything like that. Let me ask, what is the point? And that's a really realistic question in our day and age, because you do have a whole lot of people who claim to be atheists. Well, what's the point? What's the point of doing anything? It's very nihilistic. I mean, it's very like, well, that's terrible. Now, Solomon is not saying there is nothing under the sun. But what he's going to do is, throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, in a lot of points, he's going to pretend there is nothing above the sun. And a lot of his conclusions are going to be based on that concept. And then every now and then, he's going to pop his head back up and say, just to remind you, though, in case you're getting lost in the book, there is someone above the sun. And that someone will judge, and that someone will reward, and that someone is in charge, and that someone will take care of things. And then he pops his head back under the clouds and then plays some mental games with you, and then pops his head back up and then says it again, just to make sure you're paying attention. And then so that's where you have to be so careful about the book of Ecclesiastes. But this is why we should listen to Solomon. Now, let's look at a few of his qualifications, and we'll call it a morning. All right? Look at it. It says this: I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So first qualification, this guy was the king. He was in charge. He was extremely wise. He was extremely rich. He was extremely powerful. And so this is not some guy that you see sitting on the side of the street that's like, oh man, if I were in charge, I could really change things. No, this is a guy who literally was in charge, who literally changed things, who did about as much as you could do that satisfies. And he says, okay, so my first qualification is I was king. People answered to me. People respected me. People honored me. I had the popularity. You know who the king is. Whether you like him or not, you know who he is. And so you look at this guy and you say, he had it all, but we'll start with his power and his popularity and his fame and his honor. He had all of that. But then he goes and he says this, I was king, so I could do whatever I wanted to. And verse 13, and I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom. So his second qualification is he was a wise man. Now you might look at some of the stuff he did and go, well, that doesn't seem too wise. But if you think of it in terms of a science experiment where he's trying to keep as clear ahead as possible and he's saying, I'm going to do this on purpose because I want to figure out what satisfies. Let's remove God from the picture and let's try to find out what satisfies outside of God. I'm going to try it. And as you read, he says, I kept my wisdom about me. Like he kept his senses. He still did some extremely stupid things. Because when you do those, God still brings judgment in your life, especially for the idolatry that he got into. But what he's doing is he's just boiling it all down and saying, this is the end result. Let me explain. And so he says, I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all the things that are done under heaven. This sore travail that God has given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun. And behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. And then he starts talking about a bunch of stuff that he had no control over. He says, that which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. I've been to a lot of churches. I've been in and out of a lot of them. And one of the things I'm noticing about a lot of California churches is a lot of California churches had a heyday, and they're now on the other side of that heyday, and who knows where God's going to lead from there. So you will find a lot of churches around California that have massive facilities, but not massive crowds. And God saw fit to have that happen. And I don't know if it all happened at the same time or what, but you will notice that there was almost like this peak where a bunch of these different churches around California and around the country were really, really big. And now, for various reasons, they're not very big. And as much as you try, and as much as you want, and as much as you say, I want to see the church grow, but you look at it and say, but I'm not going to compromise the truth. You know what? A lot of times they don't grow. Because you're refusing to compromise the truth, which is what you're supposed to do. And God says, that's okay. That's okay. I don't need a big crowd. When I came on earth, of all these hundreds and hundreds of people, I had 12 disciples. And one of them was a traitor. And he looks and he says, yeah, I don't need huge crowds. I did it with 11 people. And then I converted a random extremist Jew. And he did a ton of work for me. Just one guy. And just like bringing little sidekicks along. And it turned the world upside down. In one generation. I don't need a big crowd. But you'll notice, because there's a lot of things like that in our life, that we're like, I want to change this. And God's like, no. I'm not going to let you change that. Now, you still work to change it. You still let people know. You still work. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's God that does the work, and it's He who makes things straight or crooked. And you can't straighten out what God has made crooked, and you can't make crooked what God has made straight. And so Solomon is recognizing that and saying, before we even get into the depths of this discussion, you do have to understand that part of the frustration of life is the fact that God is sovereign, God is in charge, and He's going to do stuff that you go, why are you doing that, God? And He's like, don't worry about it. Just focus on what I've asked you to do. And that's where he's saying, I have seen the works that are done under the sun. And then he says, that which is crooked cannot be made straight. That which is wanting cannot be numbered. He says, I commune with my heart, saying, I am come to great estate. I've gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart has great experience of wisdom and knowledge. So we're dealing with a powerful guy. We're dealing with a guy who had a lot of wisdom. We're dealing with a guy who had his mind about him. We're dealing with a guy who recognized the sovereignty of God in situations. He didn't always live it, but at least he recognized it. And then he recognizes that he can use his abilities to learn some stuff. So he's not a dummy. He's not one of those guys who you're like, well, you're a moron. No, he's like, I had the knowledge, and now I'm going to apply it to life. And look what he does. He says, I gave my heart to know wisdom, to know madness and folly, and I perceived this also is vexation of spirit. It's frustrating. It's painful. And that's not always bad. We understand that in much wisdom is much grief, as he says in the next verse, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. Any of you who've had kids or grandkids, or you've worked with the next generation, and you see them about to repeat the same mistake you did, and you're like, stop. It brings sorrow to you because you see what they're about to do and they're not listening. And so it has nothing to do with the fact that you're trying to do the right thing. It's entirely based on, I have enough wisdom to know, I know how that ends. You don't have the wisdom yet, and you might be about to learn the wisdom of experience. I wish you'd learn the wisdom of your elders, but you're about to learn it the hard way. And so Solomon is looking at that and going, as I learned, and as I studied, and as I watched the people around me, it was sorrowful, and it was painful, and it was frustrating, because even though I'm the wisest man who ever lived, there's still people who don't listen to me. And then we'll end just here in chapter 2, and look at some of the things that make Solomon our guide. I said in my heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore, enjoy pleasure. So the first thing Solomon does is he says, after building my resume, so to speak, the first job I'm going to set myself to is I'm just going to live the riotous lifestyle. Let's go live the party life. And he just goes, it's empty. Now, I think we'd all agree with that. I mean, I think we'd all go, well, of course the party life is empty. That's why you don't tend to keep doing it after you're young. You kind of learn that's painful. I don't want to keep doing that. It's kind of dumb. But he did it, and he comes at the end and he goes, "It's vanity." And he says, "I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it?" I mean, yeah, laughter's great and mirth is great, but I mean, it's like crackling of thorns under a pot. It's here and there and it's gone, and it leaves no lasting thing. So he says, let me then go to something else. And he says, I gave my heart to give myself to wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom. So he's like, I'm trying to keep my senses about me as I give myself to things like wine. And he says, and I want to lay hold on folly. So he's grabbing on to like some of these foolish things and trying them. And he says, I want to see what's good for the sons of men, which they do under the sun, under the heaven all the days of their life. And he says, all right, let me go to something a little more permanent. I made me great works. So he gets into architecture, he gets into building. He says, I builded me houses, I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchard and planted trees in them of all kinds of fruits. He's doing all this work to leave a lasting legacy of like, I'm going to plant a tree. That'll last forever. Hey, I'm going to build a house, and it'll be a nice big fancy house. He says, not only that, I made me pools of water, to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. I had great possessions of great and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. So he's like, I am exceeding everyone around me to make sure that just in case it was that one more cow that made you happy. I'm going to get that one more cow, just to one up everybody. And he's like, it didn't work. I'm going to have one more house. I have 13 houses already. Maybe house number 14 is the key one. Nope. How about 15? Nope. Okay, 17. We'll just skip 16 and go. And what his point is all the things, and you bring it to modern day America, all the things that we live for, that we say, no, this will give me the satisfaction that I need. It won't. In fact, there's people who are like, you will have a hit and a rise for like 6 months. You're like, yeah, you got that big fancy thing. Yeah, about 6 months maybe it'll satisfy. And then what's next? It's just the way it works. And Solomon was saying this back thousands of years ago. And he says, I gathered me also silver and gold. I mean, you hear talk, they like to scream like tax the rich and all this. And they're like, you do realize that they don't actually literally have like $1 billion sitting in the bank, right? Like it's tied up in business ventures. And, unless you sell them, you don't have that money. Solomon did. I mean, he was sitting on gold and silver, so that literally he's like, oh, you want me to spend it? Sure, I can. So he has wealth in stuff and tied up in buildings and properties, but he also has it in a way that he can spend. And I mean, he's just got everything. And you read some of the stuff that he had shipped in from other lands where he's like, I have cedar and spices, and I seem to remember gorillas. I don't know, but I mean, he's just got exotic animals coming in. And he's like, you want a zoo? I've got a zoo. And I mean, he's just bringing in all of this menagerie. And he's saying, anything I wanted, I had. And then he goes and he says, I also gathered to me silver and gold and the peculiar treasures of kings in the provinces. I mean, and think about that. You know, one of my vices, if you could say it, I love fancy books. You know, I love a well-crafted leather book that just has a nice fancy cover. And there was a pastor who was getting rid of a bunch of books, and he had some books from late 1800s that were like, you know, Bible, you know, books. And they were hard covers with the ribbings and all of that. And those are some of my more valuable books that I keep on my shelf because I'm like, they're just fancy. Think about some of the peculiar treasures that kings could collect. Think about the fancy books or the fancy artifacts. They don't really have a whole lot of value outside of that other than being, yeah, I brought a pyramid from Egypt, you know, and he's like, hey, look at this fancy thing I've got. And he says, I've got all the things you could desire, but I've got these peculiar treasures too, like gifts from kings. They're valuable to me. They might not be to you, but they're valuable to me. And so he's got like everything. And he says, I got, you know, you think about MP3 players today with the music on them. And he's like, not only did I have that, I had the actual artists singing for me. You know, and so I could strike up the band and say, sing that famous song of yours. He says, I had me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. So I was great, and I was increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. And whatsoever my heart desired, mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was the portion of my labor. So he wasn't like the guy who works his whole life and never gets to enjoy what he worked for. This is a guy who enjoyed his work, who worked well, who had the profit, who had the wealth, who had the stuff. And he's coming at the end of his life and he says, then I looked on all the works that my hand had wrought, and on all the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. Now we'll pause right there because that's a really depressing statement if you don't pay attention to the context. You notice the key here. He says all was vanity and vexation. All was empty and frustrating and painful, had no profit under the sun. Key word there. Solomon's legacy did have profit. Solomon's work did have profit, because he has left such a lasting legacy for us that is more valuable than anything. I mean, you talk about wisdom being more precious than rubies, and all the things you could desire are not compared to her. And so Solomon's legacy and his work is unbelievably profitable. But to him, under the sun, pointless, meaningless. All the things he strove to do. And so here's the conclusion. And to conclude, look at Ecclesiastes chapter 12, because there's a bunch more we could say, but I want to wrap this up. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, look at verse 9. This is the conclusion of conclusions, if you will, because Ecclesiastes, end of 11 into just before this, is kind of his wrap-up to his speech. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 9, because there's so much Solomon could say, and Lord willing, next week we'll look at some of the things he was leading us toward. So I challenge you, if you have a chance this week to read through Ecclesiastes, and if you have questions and things like that, I'd love to take kind of a question-answer time if you have them. But I want to kind of wrap up this morning at least with Ecclesiastes 12:9, and he says, and moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. I think that's a powerful thing, because what you have is you have a guy who's made a lot of mistakes, who's done a lot of sin, who's done a lot of things, and what we can get in the habit of doing is, well, I did that. I'm afraid of being a hypocrite by bringing that up and confronting someone else about the same sin that I did. I compare it to David. You look at David and you look at some of the stuff David did with adultery and things like that, and then you look at what his kids got into, and David seemed to basically be ashamed to say, well, I can't touch that issue because I did the same thing. I mean, because you look, like Amnon and Tamar, that was what David had done, just in a different context. And what does David do about it? Nothing. I don't want to psychoanalyze the guy, but I really think part of it was a shame of saying, I did the same thing and now I'm afraid to confront because I'll be a hypocrite. It's better to be a hypocrite and just stand for what's right and say, yes, I did that. Don't let that stop you. And so Solomon, he realizes that his words, because of some of the things he did, probably are going to be questioned by people. And yet he still says, nope, still going to teach the people knowledge. I realize that I have not lived this, but I'm still going to teach it. I realize that there are a lot of things here that I'm telling you, like the whole part of chapter 12 is, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, and don't live a certain way. And he's like, yeah, I understand I didn't live that way. Okay. But look what he does. Because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed, and he sought out, and he set in order many proverbs. And the preacher sought to find acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even the words of truth. And then this is the powerful thing, because as you read through Ecclesiastes this week, I want you to think of where it's prodding you. Because it says, the words of the wise are as goads. Specifically, the illustration there is like a cattle prod. And you're stubborn, and you're frustrating, and you're like, no, I'm not doing it. And a cattle prod comes along and goes, and gets you going in the right direction, or it's going to hurt you. In fact, Jesus uses this with Paul to say it is hard for you to kick against the pricks. It's that cattle prod that you're being poked and poked and poked and poked, and you're like, stop it. Well, the words of the wise are like that. And then he says, and not only are they like cattle prods, but they are like nails fastened by the masters of assemblies. And so the illustration here is, you think about a hook that you hang something on to anchor it. So you set a tent spike and you're wrapping that tent down to the tent spike, or you got a nail in the wall that you're anchoring something to. He says the words of the wise are cattle prods, and they're also that supporting anchor that will ground you. Those are the two illustrations. And he says the words of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assembly, which are given from one shepherd, and further by these, my son, be admonished. Of the making of many books there is no end, and much study is the weariness of the flesh, but let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. So we've seen Solomon as a worthy guide. Lord willing, next week we'll look at where he's leading us specifically, but I want to jump all the way to the conclusion, because what he's going to do is he's going to say, let's talk about the life worth living. Let's talk about what our job is. Let's boil it all down. Like we've got 12 chapters of discussion. Let's condense it all down into just one rememberable phrase. And he says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. You're being prodded in a certain direction. What do you do? Two things. Fear God. Keep His commandments. That's it. That is the prophet that you have. And as you read through 1 Peter and 2 Peter and other books of the Bible, you're going to have false prophets creeping in. You're going to have questions. You're going to have doubts. You're going to have persecution. You're going to have suffering. You're going to have sickness. You're going to have all this confusion. And he says, don't worry about it all. Understand the sovereignty of God over those situations. He's making some things crooked that you can't make straight. He's making some things straight that you can't make crooked. There's things you want to number, but God doesn't even give you the ability to do that. Don't worry about it all. Trust His sovereignty. And at the end of the day, fear Him. That's it. That's all you have to worry about is fear God. And there's a lot of things that will speak to your conscience and say, well, I don't want to do that. But again, we've got a God above the sun who is watching it all going, I will make that right. One way or another, I will take care of that. But nobody saw me do that. I know, but God did. Under the sun, it might not make any sense. But above the sun, it does. And he's saying, fear God, and one of the ways we show we fear God is to keep His commandments. Now that fear could literally be like a knee-shaking terror, scared, and it can also be a reverence. But I do think there is a level of straight-up fear, because we understand that when we turn against God, there is some dangerous territory we have now entered. And so Solomon will say, even though you may feel self-confident to go, God didn't see that. Oh, He did. And even though you may be scared and go, I just don't know that God cares. Oh, He does. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. That's it. You don't have to worry about profit. You don't have to worry about good. You don't have to worry about success or failure, any of that. Fear God, keep